The night on the abandoned mining moon felt heavy and silent, as if the whole world was holding its breath while a lone human scavenger named Evan Hale walked through the endless fields of broken metal and forgotten machines, his boots crunching softly over rusted panels while a faint blue mist hung in the air, like trapped ghosts of old battles, every step echoing with the weight of a life spent searching for things other people threw away. Evan's helmet light cut through the darkness and revealed twisted beams, shattered drones, and empty fuel drums as he muttered to himself that maybe today he would finally find something worth selling, something that could buy him a warm meal and a few hours of rest. But deep inside he felt a strange pull, as if something hidden in this wasteland was calling to him, pulling him deeper into the maze of metal and dust. He stopped when he heard it. A soft trembling sound, too weak to be wind, too alive to be a broken machine. It came again, a tiny whimper like a frightened creature trying not to be heard. Evan froze, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the shadows. Because on this moon nothing alive should be here, and anything alive usually meant trouble. Still, his heart refused to ignore the sound, and he moved forward slowly, pushing aside a pile of shattered panels until he saw a faint silver glow coming from underneath a stack of crushed cargo pods. The glow flickered like a heartbeat, and Evan knelt, digging carefully through the debris, his gloves scraping metal as the weak sound grew clearer, shaky breathing mixed with fear. When he finally pulled away the last piece of metal, his breath caught in his chest. Lying curled beneath the wreckage like a wounded star was a young alien girl, her skin a soft silver tone pulsing with dim light, her hair tangled, glowing faintly like moonlit threads, and her eyes half open but full of terror. She looked no older than 14 by human standards, but her features were unlike any species he had seen in all his years wandering the outer belt. She flinched when the beam of his helmet light touched her face, raising a thin arm in fear as if she expected to be struck. Evan immediately lowered the light and whispered gently that he wasn't going to hurt her, but she didn't seem to understand him. She only stared at him with trembling eyes and whispered one broken word in a language he barely recognized, a word that chilled his blood. "Hunter," she breathed, voice cracking like crystal under pressure. Before Evan could speak, she tried to crawl backward, but her leg was pinned under a heavy beam and she cried out in pain. Evan's heart tightened and he shoved the metal aside with all his strength, lifting her carefully into his arms as she whimpered softly, her small hands clutching weakly at his jacket as if he were the only thing holding her to life. Her skin was cold, her body shaking violently, and Evan knew she wouldn't survive long in the open night. He didn't know who she was or how she ended up in this scrapyard, but leaving her here felt like leaving a child to die, something no human with a soul could ever do. He carried her toward his old cargo ship parked at the edge of the dump, moving quickly through the shadows while his mind raced with questions. Who were the hunters she feared? Why was she abandoned here? Why was her body glowing like unstable plasma? And why did he feel that saving her might pull him into something far bigger than his simple life? The moon trembled with distant rumbling, like engines powering up somewhere far beyond the horizon, and Evan knew he wasn't alone. Someone or something else was searching. Inside the ship, he laid her gently on the warm cot and scanned her for injuries. Her heartbeat was weak but steady, her breathing uneven, and strange symbols shimmered faintly on her skin as if written with living light. She opened her eyes fully for the first time and stared at him, her gaze filled with both confusion and desperate hope. Evan spoke softly, telling her she was safe, though he wasn't sure it was true, but she seemed to understand his tone if not his words. Her trembling eased and she reached out a thin hand, touching his wrist with surprising trust. He told her his name, pointing to himself, Evan, and then gently pointed to her. Waiting for any response, she hesitated as if afraid to speak, then whispered a name so fragile it almost broke apart in the air. Liara. The engines outside grew louder, a deep thunder shaking the ship. Liara's eyes widened with raw fear and she grabbed Evan's arm. Pleading with a voice that shook him to his core, she whispered that the hunters had found her, and if they caught her again, they would take her, break her, use her, and then they would come for him too. Evan didn't understand everything she said, but the fear in her voice told him enough. He rushed to the cockpit and scanned the horizon, spotting 3 dark ships slicing through the night sky like predatory shadows, their light sweeping across the metal wasteland, searching for the silver glow they had lost, searching for Liara. Evan's pulse quickened as he powered up his engines, glancing back at the frightened alien girl who curled into herself like a trembling leaf. His hands tightened on the controls, a strange feeling rising in his chest. Not fear, but something heavier, a promise he had not spoken yet. The hunters were closing in, the moon shaking as their ships descended. Liara whispered his name now, trying to say it properly. Trying to trust him, Evan made his choice. A choice that would change both of their lives. He ignited the engines and blasted off into the sky, the ship trembling violently as debris and dust exploded beneath them while Liara clung to the seat straps, her eyes wide with terror and hope tangled together. As they broke through the cloud layer, the hunters spotted them and gave chase, beams of blue energy cutting through the night as Evan pushed the thrusters to their limits. Liara stared out the window, her voice cracking as she whispered that they would never stop hunting her. Never stop until they had taken everything from her again. Evan met her gaze through the reflection in the glass and told her with quiet strength that as long as she was with him, they would have to go through a human first. Liara didn't fully understand his words, but she understood his tone, and for the first time since he found her, she breathed without shaking, though fear still clung to her like shadows. Her glowing eyes softened, filled with something like fragile hope, and as the stars opened before them in silent darkness, she whispered the final warning that would change Evan's fate forever. They will come for me, and for you. The ship drifted through the quiet stretch of outer space like a wounded bird trying to catch its breath, soft lights humming across the metal walls while Evan Hale kept glancing back at the small alien girl, curled under a blanket on the narrow bunk. Liara's silver skin glowed faintly in the dim cabin light, rising and falling with every shaky breath she took, her eyes closed but her fingers tightly gripping the blanket, as if she feared it might vanish the moment she loosened her hold. Evan sat across from her, elbows on his knees, wondering how fate had pushed him into something so strange and so heavy. He had seen abandoned machines, broken drones, forgotten weapons, even wounded animals, but never an abandoned child from a species he couldn't name, and never one being hunted with such ruthless persistence. He watched the bruise-like glow on her arm pulse slowly, and he could still hear her voice trembling when she whispered the word, "Hunters." The fear in her tone still echoed in the back of his mind like a warning he didn't fully understand. He quietly placed a warm pack beside her leg, adjusting her blanket with careful hands, and she shifted slightly, her eyes fluttering open as if waking from a nightmare she never truly left. The moment she saw him, she relaxed, though her breathing remained shallow like someone used to sleeping in fear. She whispered his name, clumsy but trying, Van, and he smiled gently, telling her she was safe for now. Though he wasn't sure how long that safety would last, Liara tried to sit up but winced. One hand pressing over her ribs, Evan helped her lean back, and she looked at him with eyes that held more questions than any child should ever carry. She pointed toward the window where the stars streaked past, her voice soft as she asked in her broken human syllables if they were far from the moon. Evan nodded and told her they were putting distance between themselves and the hunters. She repeated the word hunters with a small shiver, as if the very sound of it tasted like terror. To distract her, Evan warmed a nutrient pack and handed it to her. She studied it like a strange object before lifting it to her lips, taking slow, careful sips. When the warmth reached her stomach, she let out a soft breath and whispered something Evan didn't understand. But the gratitude was clear in her eyes. It was the kind of gratitude that came from someone who had not been shown kindness in a very long time. As the hours passed, Evan began asking simple questions, pointing to objects around the cabin, teaching her words while she tried to speak back in her delicate voice. She learned quickly, repeating the words with surprising clarity. Light, ship, safe, and finally, Evan. She said that one differently, with a softness that made him pause for a moment, sensing something deeper behind her tone, something like trust forming slowly in the quiet space between them. Later, when she grew strong enough to sit without trembling, she began drawing shapes on the blanket with her fingertips, elegant symbols that glowed softly before fading away. Evan watched in silence until she noticed his gaze and hesitated. Unsure if she should continue, he nodded gently, encouraging her, and she took a slow breath before explaining in broken speech that these were marks of her people, memories carved into light, stories told not in words but patterns. She told him her people used to share these with their families, their clans before the hunters came. Her voice cracked when she said the word clans, as if remembering something painful. Evan reached out and squeezed her hand, not saying anything but offering the comfort of a human touch. She leaned closer without thinking, resting her forehead against his shoulder for a brief moment before pulling away shyly, as if unsure whether she was allowed to feel safe. Evan asked her gently how she ended up in the scrap dump, and silence fell heavy between them. Liara wrapped her arms around herself and stared at the floor, the glow on her skin dimming like a candle losing strength. She whispered that she had been taken from her home, separated from her family, transported in a cage with others of her kind, hunted for reasons she could not understand, and when a battle broke out among their captors, she escaped by accident, tumbling into the scrap fields where she tried to hide. She told him that the hunters wanted her alive, not for mercy but for something far darker, and Evan felt a cold anger rise inside him, an anger he hadn't felt in years. He asked her what they wanted from her, and Liara shook her head with trembling fear, whispering that she didn't know everything, only that her people were born with light in their blood, light that could be taken, used, twisted, harvested. Evan clenched his jaw, realizing the hunters weren't simple mercenaries. They were part of something cruel and powerful enough to destroy entire clans for profit. He felt his hands tighten without noticing, but he softened when he saw her watching him anxiously. He promised her he wouldn't let anyone take her again, and Liara stared at him as if she had never heard a promise spoken with such steady truth. Slowly she reached out and touched his hand, her voice barely above a whisper as she repeated his words. Safe. With you. The ship drifted through the dark as they shared a quiet moment, but it didn't last because the warning alarm suddenly blinked red on the console, a sharp beeping that sliced through the calm. Evan rushed to the controls and scanned the incoming data, his heartbeat dropping as he saw the signature of a tracking pulse, one far stronger and more focused than before. Someone had tagged them. Someone was closing the distance fast. Liara stood beside him, trembling, her eyes glowing brighter as fear surged through her small frame. She whispered that they found her again. Evan grabbed her shoulders gently and told her to stay close, his voice filled with a quiet determination that surprised even him. He didn't know how far these hunters would go or how unstoppable they truly were. But looking at Liara now, fragile yet trying so hard to be brave, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would protect her, even if the whole galaxy came after them. And somewhere deep in the darkness outside, engines roared to life, moving fast, hungry, and ready to strike again as Liara whispered the same word she had spoken on the moon, the word that felt like the beginning of a storm, Hunter. The moment the tracking alarm began its sharp beeping, the entire ship felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves sensed the danger closing in. Evan Hale gripped the controls with steady hands even though his heartbeat pounded like a drum inside his chest. The cold blue lights reflected across his face as he pushed the thrusters harder, trying to outrun the shadow that followed them through the void. Liara stood behind him, her small fingers gripping the edge of the seat so tightly. Her knuckles glowed brighter than the ship's panels, her silver eyes wide, flickering with fear and something else that Evan couldn't place yet. Outside the window, a dark silhouette appeared, tearing through the stars like a hungry predator. The hunter ship was sleek, fast, and shaped like a blade meant to pierce through worlds. Evan cursed under his breath and threw the ship into a dive, the engines growling as the hull shook from the sudden shift. Liara stumbled, but Evan reached back instinctively, catching her before she fell. She clung to him for a moment, trembling, then steadied herself with a soft breath as she whispered that this wasn't just any hunter ship. This was one of their elite stalkers, the kind sent only for targets that mattered. Evan didn't know why a child like Liara mattered so much, but he knew the intensity of the chase told him everything he needed to understand. Her life was priceless to those who wanted to use her, and dangerous to anyone who tried to protect her. The hunter ship opened fire, blue beams cracking across the darkness, slicing through empty space with deadly precision. Evan jerked the controls left, then right, dodging the blast as sparks flew across the cabin. Liara cried out when one shot grazed the hull, leaving a molten scar along the side of the ship. Evan shouted for her to strap herself in, and she did so quickly, her hands shaking as she pulled the harness across her chest. She kept her glowing eyes on him, as if watching him was the only thing keeping her grounded in the chaos. Another energy blast slammed into their shields, rattling the entire vessel and throwing Evan forward. He regained control just in time to dive into a narrow asteroid corridor, hoping the rocks would slow their pursuer. The ship weaved between spinning stones and drifting debris, the engine screaming with effort. Evan's breath grew sharp as he maneuvered through the twisted maze. But the hunter ship followed flawlessly, moving with frightening accuracy. Liara stared out the window as the hunter ship grew closer, its front lights casting an eerie glow that reflected across her silver skin. She suddenly pressed her palm against the glass, her breath trembling as she whispered that they were close, too close, that they wanted her alive and they would not stop. Evan shouted back that he would not let them take her, and the conviction in his voice made Liara's eyes widen. as if she wasn't used to someone fighting for her instead of abandoning her. The next blast struck the rear thrusters, and the ship lurched, alarms screaming through the cabin. Liara cried out in pain even though the blast hadn't touched her. She clutched her chest, her skin flaring with bright silver light. Evan looked at her in shock, asking what was happening. But Liara couldn't answer. The glow intensified, pulsing like a heartbeat that was too strong, too wild, too dangerous. Suddenly the hunter ship swooped in front of them, blocking their path, forcing Evan to bring the ship to a halt. They were trapped, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Evan grabbed a blaster from beneath the console and told Liara to stay behind him. But Liara shook her head, tears shining in her eyes as she whispered that running would not save them anymore. The hunter ship's docking claws extended, ready to latch onto their hull. Evan braced himself for a boarding assault. But before he could stand, Liara screamed, not in fear but in something deeper, something awakening. Her body glowed brighter than ever before, silver light pouring from her skin like liquid stars. The air around her vibrated with an unfamiliar energy. The cabin lights flickered, the panels buzzed, and Evan stared in stunned silence as Liara stood shaking violently, holding her hands to her head as if trying to contain something inside her. She whispered that she couldn't hold it in, that they forced this power awake before she was ready, that she didn't know how to stop it. The hunter ship began cutting through the hull, sparks lighting up the front window. Evan raised his blaster, ready to fight. But Liara took a step forward and reached out with trembling hands, her palms glowing like burning moons. The hunter ship's metal began to twist and warp as if crushed by invisible pressure. The claws retracted in panic, the entire vessel shaking violently as Liara's power surged outward. Evan shouted for her to stop, afraid the power would tear her apart. But she couldn't hear him anymore. She stood glowing in the middle of the cabin, tears streaming down her cheeks as the light spread through the entire ship. The hunter vessel outside cracked open with a screeching metallic wail, collapsing like a crumpled can as Liara released one last desperate burst of energy that sent shockwaves tumbling through the asteroid field. When the light faded, Liara collapsed to her knees, breathing hard, her glow dimming back to a fragile silver shimmer. Evan dropped beside her, pulling her into his arms as she sobbed softly. Terrified by her own power, he held her close, whispering that she was safe, that she did nothing wrong, that he wasn't afraid of her, but she shook her head in denial, hiding her face in his shoulder, whispering that the hunters would now know she had awakened. Outside the window, pieces of the destroyed hunter ship drifted silently through space. But Evan knew this victory was only a beginning, and Liara knew it too, because her final trembling words filled the cabin with a new, heavier truth. They saw me, they felt me, and now they will send more. The silence after the explosion felt almost unreal, as if space itself was holding its breath. The shattered remains of the hunter ship, drifting like dark snowflakes across the void while Evan guided his damaged vessel away from the asteroid field, every movement slow and careful because the engines groaned with each push. Liara sat in the co-pilot seat wrapped in a blanket, her small frame trembling not from cold but from the weight of what she had unleashed, her silver glow now dim and soft, flickering like a candle fighting the last bit of wind. Evan kept looking at her, not with fear but with a quiet worry that he couldn't hide. She had saved their lives, yet he could see she was terrified of herself even more than the hunters chasing her. She whispered that she didn't mean to destroy the ship. She didn't know how the power came out. She didn't know how to stop it once it awakened. Her voice cracked with every word full of guilt she didn't deserve. Evan leaned over and placed a hand gently on her shoulder, telling her that she did what she needed to do to survive. But Liara shook her head slowly, her glowing eyes filling with tears as she whispered that her people called this the ancestral surge, a force that only appeared in rare bloodlines that were supposed to be protected and guided, not hunted and broken apart. Evan asked her softly what she meant, and Liara hesitated, the silence stretching across the cabin like a fragile thread ready to break. Finally she began speaking, her voice trembling but steady enough to reveal the truth buried deep inside her memories. She told him that she came from a clan known as the Leoran, beings whose ancestors carried living light in their veins, light that grew stronger with emotion, stronger with age, stronger with destiny. The Leoran used this light not as a weapon, but as a way to heal, protect, and shape energy around them. They were guardians of peace, protectors of smaller species, but their power made them targets in a galaxy filled with greed. Liara looked down, her hands glowing faintly as she admitted she was one of the last children born with the purest form of Leoran light. a bloodline so rare that her people had kept her birth hidden, hoping she could grow safely until she learned to control her energy. But the hunters found out they came with ships, with chains that drained the light, with devices that trapped her people's power. Her voice broke as she whispered that they took everyone. Her clan, her family, her protectors, all captured or killed, and she had been one of the only ones smuggled away by desperate hands during the chaos, dropped into escape pods meant to scatter across the system. But hers malfunctioned and crashed onto the scrap moon where Evan found her. Evan listened in silence, feeling a heaviness build in his chest. He had known she was important, but he had never imagined her origins were tied to a people hunted for being too pure, too powerful, too rare. He asked her gently about the hunters and why they wanted her so badly. Liara whispered the word syndicate with a shiver, telling him they were not just mercenaries but an entire criminal empire, operating in the shadows of the galaxy. They harvested rare species, powerful DNA, ancient abilities, anything that could be sold to the highest bidder. Liara told him they believed the Lioran light could be extracted and turned into a weapon, or sold as pure energy worth entire cities. Evan clenched the controls so hard his knuckles turned white as anger burned inside him. Not the loud kind, but the cold, steady kind that lodged itself deep inside the heart. Watching Liara hug herself, looking so small and so lost, made something inside him tighten painfully. She had barely survived, and yet someone wanted to tear apart her very essence. He couldn't understand how anyone could look at her and see anything but a child that needed protection. Liara wiped her eyes slowly and asked Evan why he helped her, why he didn't leave her behind like others might. Evan blinked, taken aback by her question. He told her the truth in a quiet voice. He said that he had seen enough cruelty in the galaxy to know that kindness was the only thing that made humans worth anything, and leaving her there would have made him no better than the monsters who hunted her. Liara stared at him with a mixture of confusion and warmth, as if his answer didn't match the galaxy she knew, as if humans were far different from what she had been taught. A soft alarm beeped, pulling Evan's attention to the navigation screen. The ship had reached a drifting safe zone, an old abandoned outpost floating near a collapsed trade route. He guided the ship inside, hoping to make repairs and hide while Liara recovered her strength. The docking clamps engaged with a hiss and Evan powered down the engines, the lights dimming as silence settled again, the kind of silence that came after storms. Heavy and thoughtful, Liara followed him to the maintenance bay, still wrapped in her blanket, watching him work with curious eyes. She finally asked him something unexpected, her voice soft. She wanted to know why humans fight so fiercely for others, why Evan risked his life for someone he had just met. Evan paused, leaning against the open panel, thinking about an answer that would make sense to someone who had lost her entire world. He finally told her that humans fight hardest when they care, even if they care too quickly, even if it hurts them later, because caring was the only thing that made them human. Liara stared at him for a long moment, her silver eyes glowing softly, and Evan saw something new in her expression, something deeper than gratitude, something that felt like the slow beginning of trust becoming something else, something stronger, something that scared her and comforted her at the same time. She whispered that she would protect him too, that even if she didn't know how to control her power, she would not let the hunters take him from her. Before Evan could reply, the outpost lights flickered, a distant vibration humming through the walls like the heartbeat of something waking up. Liara stiffened, sensing at first, her glow brightening with fear. Evan rushed to the console and checked the scanners, his stomach dropping as he saw the signatures approaching from the far edge of the system. A fleet, not a single hunter ship this time, not a small squad, but an entire formation moving in tight formation, silent and deadly, closing in on their location with terrifying precision. Liara grabbed Evan's arm, her voice trembling as she whispered the words he hoped never to hear again. They found us, and this time they won't stop. The abandoned outpost felt colder the moment the fleet appeared on the scanner, its silent metal corridors turning into hollow tunnels of dread, as Evan stared at the glowing red blips moving steadily toward them. Each one a hunter ship designed for capture, not mercy. Liara stood beside him, her small hand gripping his sleeve with quiet desperation, her silver eyes wide and glowing brighter with fear. As if her own body sensed the danger long before her mind could process it, Evan swallowed hard, knowing the outpost couldn't withstand even a single blast from the fleet. They had only minutes before the hunters reached them, minutes to decide whether to run, hide, or fight a battle. They had no chance of winning. He turned to Liara and told her they had to move, his voice calm but edged with urgency. She nodded quickly, her breath shaky as they rushed down the narrow corridor back to their ship, the lights flickering above them with each distant vibration. As the approaching fleet activated its weapons, Liara paused once, glancing up at the ceiling as if she could feel the heat of the hunter engines through the metal walls. Evan gently pulled her forward, telling her they didn't have time to freeze, not now, not when the entire sky was turning into a trap. Inside the ship they strapped in, the engines roaring awake like a sleeping beast pushed into battle. Evan set a course through the fractured rings surrounding the old outpost, hoping the debris field would buy them a few precious moments. Liara's hands shook as she buckled her harness, her glow pulsing like a distressed heartbeat. She whispered that there were too many, her voice trembling with a fear she could barely contain. Evan placed a steady hand on her shoulder and told her that as long as they kept moving, there was still a chance, even if the chance was paper thin. The first wave of hunter ships broke through the darkness, engines burning bright as they opened fire, blue beams ripping across the void like lightning. Evan dove the ship downward, barely dodging the shots as they streaked past the hull. The cabin rattled violently, metal groaning from the impact of shock waves. Liara gasped and clung to the seat straps as sparks rained from an overhead panel. Evan gritted his teeth and pushed the engines harder, twisting through the broken remains of old trade ships and shattered satellites drifting like skeletons in the sky. A blast struck their rear shield, shaking the entire vessel and throwing Liara forward. Evan reached out instinctively, grabbing her arm to steady her before forcing the ship into a sharp turn. The hunters followed with cold precision, their formation tightening like a net closing in on prey. Evan cursed under his breath as the scanners filled with more signatures. Dozens of ships moving together, each one focusing its sensors on Liara's light. He could almost feel their hunger, cold and monstrous, reaching through the darkness toward her. Liara squeezed her eyes shut and whispered that she didn't want to hurt anyone. She didn't want to lose control again. Evan leaned toward her, speaking firmly, reminding her that she was not a weapon, that she was not what the hunters wanted to make her, that she was more than her light, more than her power. His voice steadied her breathing for a moment. But then the largest hunter ship appeared from behind the fleet, its black wings unfolding like the shadow of a giant beast stretching across the stars. This was the flagship, the one leading the capture mission, its cannons glowing with terrifying power as it locked onto their ship. Liara whispered a single word in her language, a word Evan didn't fully understand but felt deep in his bones. It meant doom, destiny, and despair all tangled together. Evan felt a cold sweat run down his spine as the flagship fired a heavy plasma charge, a bright sphere of energy hurtling toward them like a falling star. He slammed the thrusters forward, trying to outrun the blast, but it was too fast. The explosion hit behind them, sending a massive shockwave that cracked through the hull. Alarms screamed, panels burst into sparks, and Liara was thrown from her seat. Evan grabbed her midair and pulled her into his arms as the ship spun out of control, the world around them turning into a blur of light and smoke. Liara clutched Evan's jacket, tears streaming down her glowing cheeks as she whispered that she didn't want him to die, her voice trembling as her light flickered wildly. Evan held her tightly, whispering that he wasn't dying. Not today, not while she needed him. The ship crashed onto a barren moon below, the landing rough and violent, metal tearing, engines burning, dust exploding into the air as they skidded across the rocky surface until everything finally stopped. Silence swept through the cabin for a moment, broken only by Liara's ragged breathing. Evan stood shakily, pulling her up with him, both bruised and shaken but still alive. Outside the horizon glowed with the arrival of the hunter fleet descending toward them like dark wings of an approaching storm. Liara stepped outside the broken ship, staring at the sky filled with hunters, her small body trembling as her silver glow brightened again, this time stronger, steadier, fueled by fear, anger, and the desperate need to protect the one person who had shown her kindness. Evan tried to stop her, but she shook her head and whispered that she wouldn't let them take him. She wouldn't let them hurt him, not ever. As the first hunter squad landed, weapons raised, Liara stepped forward, tears streaming down her face as her light ignited, her entire body glowing brighter than a rising sun, the ground trembling under her feet. Evan could only watch in stunned awe as warmth pressed against his skin, a gentle heat mixed with sorrow and power. Liara raised her hands, and the sky lit up with silver fire as she unleashed a wave of energy so massive it tore through the hunters like a storm of pure light, burning across the battlefield like a living star screaming in defiance. When the wave faded, Evan rushed to catch her as she collapsed into his arms, faint but alive. her voice a weak whisper against his chest. "I saved you. But they will come again. Stronger. Because now they know what I am." The wind on the barren moon carried a quiet, eerie whisper as if the planet itself was trying to warn them of what was coming next. Evan sat beside the wrecked ship with Liara resting against his chest, her breathing weak but steady, her silver glow faint like the fading light of a wounded star. The blast she had released minutes ago still shimmered across the cracked ground, leaving streaks of melted stone and drifting silver dust that floated through the air like glowing ashes of war. Evan brushed a strand of Liara's hair away from her face, gently wiping the tear trails from her cheeks. She looked so small in his arms, so fragile despite the unstoppable force she had unleashed. He whispered her name softly, afraid she might slip away if he spoke too loudly. Liara blinked slowly, her eyes glowing faintly as she tried to sit up. Evan supported her carefully, telling her to rest, telling her she had done enough for one lifetime. But Liara shook her head weakly, whispering that she couldn't rest, not while more hunters were out there, not while she still had him to protect. Evan felt something tighten in his chest, a feeling he had tried to ignore because it was too heavy, too dangerous yet too real to deny. He stared at her silver eyes filled with fear and determination, and he realized she was no longer just a child he saved. She was someone woven into his fate now, someone whose life had become tied to his in ways he hadn't expected. As Liara leaned against him, the sky above them shifted, dark clouds swirling across the thin atmosphere, the last of the hunter wreckage burning in the distance. Evan listened to her small whispers, her voice trembling as she admitted she didn't want to lose him. She didn't want the galaxy to take from her the only person who had ever held her without fear, the only one who had given her warmth, safety, and something she didn't understand but felt deeply growing inside her, something that felt like a quiet ache whenever she looked at him. Evan wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her closer as he told her that he wasn't going anywhere, not while she still needed someone beside her. Liara closed her eyes, letting out a trembling breath that sounded almost like a sob she was too tired to fully release. She whispered that her heart hurt, that she didn't understand why she felt this way around him, why his presence made her light pulse softly even when she was weak. Evan hesitated, his breath catching for a moment, because he understood what she was feeling even if she didn't yet have the words for it. He shifted slightly, brushing his thumb along the back of her hand, feeling her skin warm under his touch. Liara opened her eyes and looked up at him, her gaze soft, glowing, and full of a fragile longing she was trying to hide but couldn't control. She asked him if humans felt their hearts like this too, if humans felt their chest tighten when someone mattered too much. Evan nodded slowly, telling her that humans could feel deeply, sometimes too quickly, sometimes too strongly, and sometimes without warning. Liara's breath shook as she whispered that she didn't want these feelings to make him afraid of her. Evan smiled gently, his voice steady as he told her he wasn't afraid. He wasn't running. Her fingers curled around his hand, holding it tight, as if afraid the galaxy might tear them apart at any moment. The wind brushed across their skin, carrying the faint metallic scent of burning debris as the moon trembled softly beneath them. But the quiet moment didn't last. The sky flashed with distant lights, faint at first, then brighter, sharper, forming thin lines that streaked toward the moon like falling stars. Evan frowned and scanned the horizon, his heart sinking as he realized what they were. Drop pods, dozens of them falling from orbit, each one carrying elite hunter units sealed in metallic shells. Liara saw them too, her body stiffening with terror and exhaustion. She whispered that the flagship must have called reinforcements, this time stronger, more prepared, more determined to take her alive. Evan stood quickly, pulling Liara up with him. She stumbled but held onto his arm, her glow weak but her spirit trying desperately to remain brave. He told her they had to move. They had to find cover before the pods landed. She nodded, though her legs trembled with every step. Evan kept one arm around her, guiding her across the rough terrain toward a cluster of jagged stone formations that might shield them for a short time. The ground shook violently as the first pods crashed down behind them, sending waves of dust rolling across the moon's surface. Liara cried out softly as the shockwave nearly knocked her off her feet. Evan caught her again, lifting her gently into his arms when her legs gave out. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her forehead resting against his shoulder, whispering that she was sorry for being weak, sorry for slowing him down. Evan tightened his grip on her, telling her she was not weak, telling her she was the bravest soul he had ever known, telling her that he wasn't carrying a burden, he was carrying someone worth everything, They reached the shelter of the rocks just as more pods slammed into the ground, their metallic shells splitting open as armored hunters stepped out, their suits glowing with red visor lights, their steps heavy and cold, scanning the surface for the silver glow that marked their prey. Liara pressed her face into Evan's chest, shaking uncontrollably as she whispered that there were too many. Evan held her close as he whispered that he would protect her no matter what. Even if he had to fight an army alone. Liara slowly lifted her head, her glowing eyes filled with tears as she whispered that she didn't want to lose him, that she couldn't bear the thought of the galaxy taking him away from her. Her voice cracked with a confession she didn't fully understand, but felt with every heartbeat. She told him she cared for him, cared with a depth she didn't know she had, cared so much it frightened her. Evan gently touched her cheek, wiping away her tears, and told her he cared too, more than he had expected, more than he thought he was allowed to. But before Liara could speak again, the rocks around them trembled as the hunters closed in, their weapons drawn, their visors glowing as they locked onto Liara's fading light. Her breath hitched in terror. Evan tightened his grip on his weapon with one hand and held her firmly with the other. The final moment before the confrontation felt like the entire galaxy holding its breath, and Liara whispered in a trembling voice that shook with fear and love tangled together, "I won't let them take you, even if it destroys me." The horizon trembled with fire and shadow as the hunter fleet descended, dozens of ships slicing through the void like blades of black steel, their engines glowing with a deadly hunger. Evan Hale stood beside Liara on the rocky surface of the barren moon, his hand tight around hers, her silver light flickering softly, trembling with exhaustion and fear, yet stronger now, steadier than it had ever been. They could see the flagship at the center, massive and ominous, its cannons aimed like the claws of a predator ready to strike. And Evan felt the weight of every life lost, every battle fought pressing against his chest. Liara's small hand gripped his tightly, her voice a whisper. Fragile yet filled with determination, she told him she was ready, that she would not run, that she would not let them take him or her. Fight again? Evan nodded, feeling the same fire rise in his own chest, a human determination born from years of surviving the galaxy's cruelty. He told her that together they could end this. Not just survive, not just fight, but triumph. And for the first time, Liara allowed herself to believe that they could. The first hunter ships landed, their armor gleaming, their weapons scanning for any sign of movement. And Evan took a deep breath, adjusting his blaster. Feeling the weight of responsibility heavier than ever, he whispered that he trusted her, that no matter what happened, he believed in her. And Liara's eyes met his, glowing brighter, brighter than he had ever seen. As if the words themselves gave her courage, she raised her hands, her glow intensifying, pulsing outward like a heartbeat that reached across the battlefield, and the hunters paused, sensing the force, sensing the power that they had chased across systems, sensing something alive and unstoppable. Evan felt the heat of her energy brush against his skin, warm and vibrant, full of fear, love, and defiance all at once. He tightened his grip on her hand and whispered that he would not let her face this alone, that he was with her. The flagship fired a massive beam, and Evan dove, pulling Liara with him, the blast slicing through the rocks where they had just stood, exploding into dust and shards, the shockwave pushing them forward. Yet Liara didn't falter. She raised her hands again, her energy surging brighter, hotter, filling the sky with silver light that reflected across every surface. Evan could feel it, see it, taste it even in the air, the ground trembling beneath them. The fleet rocked with the force of her awakening. The hunters tried to close in, weapons raised, but every step forward was met with invisible pressure, every advance blocked by waves of pure light that Liara directed with careful control. Evan shouted encouragements, telling her she could do this. She was stronger than they realized, stronger than she even understood, and her glow pulsed faster, brighter, flowing from her hands to her body, radiating across the battlefield like a living star. Evan's own courage surged as he stepped forward beside her, firing at the nearest hunters, using every skill he had learned surviving the outer belt. But he knew the real force here was her, the light that had awakened in her bloodline, a force meant to protect, meant to rise above fear, meant to define the future of those who survived. He could see it in her eyes, the quiet resolve, the refusal to be broken, the fierce love for him that gave her strength. She stepped forward fully, releasing a concentrated wave of energy. A blast so powerful it tore through the hunters' formation, twisting metal, disabling engines, burning across the rocky terrain like molten silver. Evan grabbed her again as the shockwave rolled over them, shielding her body with his own, feeling her tremble in his arms yet refusing to collapse. Her voice low and steady as she whispered that she was not afraid as long as he was with her. The flagship reeled from the force, systems failing, weapons flickering, the enormous vessel breaking apart under the raw energy she commanded, and Evan realized that they had done it, not just survived, but defeated the fleet that had haunted them, that had hunted them relentlessly, that had sought to claim her power for themselves. Liara sank to her knees, exhausted, the glow in her skin dimming as her energy settled, and Evan fell beside her, holding her close, brushing her hair from her face, whispering that it was over, that they had won. Liara leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest, whispering that she had never imagined a life like this, that she had never imagined someone would fight so fiercely for her. And Evan whispered back that she was not alone, never again, that she was safe, that they would face whatever came next together. Her small hand pressed against his heart, and he could feel her pulse, feel her strength, feel the bond that had grown between them, stronger than fear, stronger than any hunter fleet, stronger than destiny itself. They rose slowly, looking out over the battlefield, the remains of ships and shattered metal floating across the moon's surface. But the stars above them were calm, the night sky stretching endlessly. Filled with quiet hope, Liara's eyes met Evan's, a soft glow reflecting trust, love, and a promise neither had spoken yet, but both understood fully. She whispered that she didn't want to be alone again, and Evan told her that she never would be, that she was his destiny, just as he had become hers. The silence of victory wrapped around them, broken only by the soft hum of the repaired engines and the distant crackle of burning debris. Liara took a step closer, her hand reaching for his, her glow now steady, warm, a living proof of her survival, of their bond, of the future they would face together. Evan took her hand, holding it firmly, his gaze sweeping across the horizon, knowing the galaxy might try again, but this time they would face it together. And as the first light of the moon reflected across her silver skin, Evan whispered softly, a promise that would carry them beyond fear, beyond darkness, beyond the hunters that had chased her across the stars. He was there when I was lost. He is my light, my strength, my destiny. And I will stay by his side forever. And in that moment, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath, knowing that two souls had found each other, unstoppable, unbroken, and shining brighter than anything the universe could ever take away. The silver light of Liara and the human who had saved her merging into one, a beacon that would never fade.